When I first bought the house, I was overwhelmed with pride and excitement. It was my first home, a small place that had been on the market for a while. It needed some work, nothing too drastic, just a few repairs and a fresh coat of paint. But that didn't concern me. I was eager to make it my own, to transform it into a place that truly felt like mine. The house had everything I had been searching for: character, history, and enough space to house all the things I had accumulated over the years. The previous owners had left behind some furniture, old pieces that added to the home's antique charm. There was even an attic, which I planned to use for storage once I had sorted through all the boxes I had brought with me. The first few days were a blur of unpacking and organizing. I spent most of my time downstairs, setting up the kitchen and living room, only venturing into the attic to stash boxes of things I didn't need immediately. The attic was a large, dusty space with exposed beams and a small window that let in just enough light to see during the day. It was cluttered with old furniture, paintings, and other odds and ends left behind by the previous owners. At first, I didn't give it much thought. The attic was just another part of the house, and I was too focused on getting everything else settled to worry about it. But that all changed on the third night. It began with a noise. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep when I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from above. It was so quiet I thought I was imagining it, but as I lay there straining to listen, the sound grew louder and more distinct. It was coming from the attic. My heart started to race, and I sat up in bed. I told myself it was probably just a rat or some other small creature that had found its way inside. Old houses like this were bound to have pests, and I hadn't had a chance to check the attic thoroughly yet. But there was something about the sound that made my skin crawl, something that didn't sit right. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was nothing, but the noise persisted, persistent and unrelenting. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep unless I checked it out. Reluctantly, I got out of bed and grabbed a flashlight. The house was eerily silent as I made my way to the attic stairs, the only sound the creaking floorboards beneath my feet. When I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Part of me wanted to turn around and go back to bed, pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I knew I couldn't. I opened the door, and the scratching sound grew louder, echoing down the stairs. My heart was pounding in my chest as I climbed the narrow steps, the beam from my flashlight cutting through the darkness. When I reached the top, I shone the light around the attic, searching for the source of the noise, but the scratching continued. I followed the sound, weaving my way through the maze of boxes and furniture until I reached the far corner of the attic. There, hidden behind a stack of old paintings, was a small wooden door I hadn't noticed before. The door was old, its wood warped and splintered, as if it hadn't been opened in years. The scratching was coming from behind it, faint but insistent, like something was trying to break through. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob and slowly turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow passage that led to a small hidden room. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the floor as I stepped inside. The room was tiny, barely large enough to stand in, and the walls were covered with old, faded wallpaper. The air was thick and musty, the smell almost overpowering. In the center of the room sat a small, tattered bed, the sheets stained with age. But what truly caught my attention was the figure sitting on the bed. It was a woman, her skin pale and sickly, her hair matted and unkempt. She was hunched over, her back to me, scratching at the wall with her fingers, digging into the plaster. My breath caught in my throat, and a wave of nausea washed over me. This wasn't some animal or a figment of my imagination. This was real. I wanted to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure before me. Then she turned around. Her eyes were wild, filled with a madness that sent a jolt of terror through me. Her face was gaunt, her cheeks hollow, her lips cracked and dry. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, filled with desperation that made my blood run cold. She stared at me for a moment, her chest heaving as if she were struggling to breathe. And then, without warning, she lunged at me. I stumbled back, barely dodging her as she clawed at the air with twisted, gnarled fingers. She screamed, a high-pitched, inhuman sound that echoed through the attic, filling the space with raw, unbridled terror. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest as I raced down the stairs, her screams still ringing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the front door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. When I finally got it open, I ran outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I kept running, not stopping until I was halfway down the street, my breath ragged and uneven. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I didn't return to the house that night. Instead, I sat in my car, staring at it, unable to process what had just happened. Who was the woman in the attic? How long had she been there? Why hadn't I noticed the hidden room before? I didn't have any answers, but one thing was certain. I couldn't stay in that house. The next morning, I called the police. I had no idea how to explain what I had witnessed, but I knew I couldn't go back into the house alone. When the officers arrived, I led them to the attic, my heart racing again. The house was silent, save for the creaking floorboards beneath our feet. I pointed out the hidden door, my hands trembling as I recounted what I had seen. The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions skeptical, but they didn't say anything. They opened the door and stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The room was just as I had left it, small, cramped, and smelling of decay. But the woman was gone. The bed was empty, the sheets still tattered and stained, but there was no sign of her. The officers searched every corner, but there was nothing there. They told me it was probably just a squatter who had fled once they realized I had moved in, but I knew that wasn't true. The woman I had seen wasn't just a squatter. There was something wrong with her, something that couldn't be explained by logic or reason. The police left after a few hours, telling me to call if I saw anything else unusual, but it was clear they didn't believe me. They thought I was just a nervous new homeowner spooked by the old house's creaks and groans. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew she was still out there, somewhere. I tried to stay in the house after that, tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that the woman in the attic was a figment of my imagination. But the fear never left. Every night, I lay in bed, straining to hear the faintest noise, the softest scratch. The house was silent, but I could feel her presence like a shadow lurking just out of sight. I began having nightmares, vivid, terrifying dreams where I was trapped in the attic, the woman's twisted face inches from mine, her hands clawing at my skin. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the fear so real that I could still feel it long after I had woken. I knew I couldn't stay in the house any longer. The fear was too much, the dread too overwhelming. I packed up my things, left most of it behind, and moved out within the week. I never went back. I don't know what happened to the woman in the attic, or how long she had been there. Maybe she was a ghost, or maybe she was something else entirely, something that defied explanation. But whatever she was, I hoped she was gone. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I still hear the faint scratching sound, the soft creak of a door opening, and I wonder, just for a moment, if she's still out there, awaiting for someone else to find her. When I bought my first house, I was just 27. I'd been saving for years, and even though it was a modest little place, I was proud to call it mine. Adjusting to living there, though, was a challenge. I'd lived with my parents all my life, along with 3 siblings and 2 dogs. The house had always been loud, full of activity and noise. But now? It was quiet, almost eerily so. That silence was the hardest part of the transition. Living alone felt strange, and for a while, I wondered if I'd ever get used to it. I'm sure anyone who's gone from living with family to being on their own can relate. One thing I loved about the house was the tiny balcony on the second floor. Don't get me wrong, I'm not even sure if you could really call it a balcony. It was so small you could barely stand on it, and there wasn't enough space for even a single chair. Still, I'd go out there most nights after work to unwind and clear my head. I smoked a lot back then but hated the smell, so smoking indoors wasn't an option. That little balcony was a lifesaver for me, a perfect compromise. I didn't even have to leave the house to enjoy a cigarette. The block I lived on was pretty typical, with houses lined up side by side. Behind my place was another row of homes, separated by tall wooden fences that marked the property lines. My balcony gave me a clear view over the fence into my neighbor's yard. It wasn't long before I realized I'd met nearly all the neighbors, except for the one behind me. To my knowledge, I'd never even seen them. No waves, no conversations, nothing. The place looked almost abandoned, though the occasional bedroom light at night suggested someone lived there. Judging by the unkempt lawn and lack of activity, I assumed it was an elderly person. But after a few weeks, curiosity got the better of me. One Saturday, I decided to walk around the block and introduce myself. The house looked rough. Rough might be an understatement. The yard was overgrown with weeds, the paint was peeling, and parts of the siding were missing. Even the walkway was stained and cracked. When I knocked on the door, there was no response. Just as I was about to leave, I noticed a flicker of movement behind the curtains. Someone was inside watching me. Feeling awkward, I turned to leave, but suddenly, the door slammed open with a loud bang. Startled, I spun around and found myself face to face with an elderly Asian woman. She was short, with gray hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her skin was deeply wrinkled, but her face was strangely tense, like she was flexing every muscle. Her wide, unblinking eyes sent a chill down my spine. She didn't say a word, just stood there staring. After an awkward pause, I introduced myself. After a long silence, she gave her name, Priscilla, and managed a faint smile. She didn't ask for my name or say anything else. She just stood there, watching me. I quickly excused myself and left, feeling unnerved. That night, I went out to the balcony, trying to shake off the strange encounter. But when I glanced into her yard, there she was, standing motionless in the middle of her lawn, staring up at my house. She didn't move or call out, just stood there, watching. It was one of the most unsettling things I'd ever experienced. Over the next few days, things got worse. One night, I saw her peering at me from her windows, moving from one to the next, always watching. Even when I pretended not to notice, I felt her eyes on me. It was unnerving. One morning, I found a single sock lying in my yard. It didn't belong to me. That was when it hit me, she'd been on my property. I felt a growing sense of unease but tried to rationalize it, convincing myself she was just confused or harmless. Then, late one night, my doorbell rang, over and over, at least a dozen times. Frustrated and tired, I went to confront her. The second I opened the door, she lunged at me with a knife, screaming something incoherent about her son. It all happened so fast. Somehow, I managed to wrestle the knife away and hold her down until the police arrived. She was yelling the entire time, her rage unrelenting. When the officers arrived, they restrained her and took her away. They told me she'd likely be sent to a psychiatric facility. I never saw her again, but the experience left a mark. It changed me, made me more cautious and wary of the world. Not long after, I decided to move. My wife Taylor and I recently moved out of our old house. She didn't enjoy being so close to her family and wanted to create some distance, so that's exactly what we did. We don't have kids, and she hasn't worked in quite some time, so she was fairly open to my suggestions on where to relocate. I'm an electrician, so moving around isn't a big deal for me. We eventually decided on New Mexico. Having both been rural folks our entire lives, it wasn't much of a lifestyle change. That was roughly 3 months ago. We found an incredible deal on a house deep in the countryside. The place is honestly larger than we need, especially with it just being the two of us and our black lab, Lola. Still, we figured the extra space would come in handy, maybe even allow us to host friends as we settled in. A couple of months passed, and that's when I began noticing something strange. The upstairs lights would trip the circuits, while the rest of the house remained powered. After this happened a few times, I knew exactly what the issue was. Being an electrician, this kind of stuff is second nature to me. I figured it'd be a straightforward fix, just a matter of rebalancing the load on the breaker, which I assumed was located in the basement. Moments like these remind me how handy it is to know how to fix things myself. To be honest, I hadn't spent much time in the basement since we'd moved in. I hadn't really needed to. We gave it a quick look during the showing, but I didn't pay much attention. Come to think of it, I'm pretty sure I hadn't been down there since that day. Anyway, I headed downstairs and began searching for the main breaker. The basement was cluttered, more of a storage space than anything else. Eventually, I found the main panel and began inspecting it. After about 10 minutes, I pinpointed the load imbalance and made a mental note to rewire it later when I had more time. As I was about to head back upstairs, curiosity got the better of me. I figured, since I was already down there, I might as well take a closer look around. After all, it's our house, and it was odd that I didn't know every corner of it. Most of the space was filled with old furniture and random junk. Nothing particularly interesting caught my eye, and I quickly realized converting it into usable space would be too much of a hassle. That's when I spotted something unusual. In the far corner of the basement, partially obscured by a stack of old wooden chairs, was a large metal door. It wasn't an ordinary door. It looked industrial grade, much taller and thicker than a typical door. I walked over to it, and my initial impression was confirmed. It reminded me of the kind of door you'd see on a safe or a panic room. My first thought was that it might be a storm shelter. But that seemed like an odd thing for the realtor to overlook mentioning. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. I went back upstairs and rummaged through the drawer of keys the previous owner had left behind, spares for random doors, in case we locked ourselves out. None of them worked on the door. After trying at least 15 different keys, I gave up. Later, I told Taylor about it, and she was as intrigued as I was. Somehow, she managed to track down the previous owners. That phone call is when my curiosity turned into concern. The conversation was peculiar. They paused frequently, as if choosing their words carefully or trying to avoid saying too much. Part of me wishes I'd recorded it, but hindsight is 20/20th. When I asked about the door, they went silent. Finally, the wife said it was a safe room for tornadoes. I mentioned it was locked and that we didn't have the key. After another pause, she claimed they'd lost it and advised us to just leave it alone. Her tone made my stomach churn. It didn't sit right with me. They'd left us keys for trivial things. Why not this? The call ended soon after, and they clearly had no interest in small talk. Taylor tried to laugh it off, telling me I was overthinking, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Over the next few weeks, I'd occasionally find myself standing in front of that door, wondering what was behind it. I tried everything I could think of to open it, even some tricks from work, but the lock held firm. Frustrated, I decided to let it go, for a while. Fast forward to 2 days ago. At Taylor's urging, I hired a locksmith. He spent about 30 minutes working on the door before I went down to check on him. He mentioned the lock was unusually complex for a simple panic room. Those were his exact words. I worried he wouldn't be able to open it, but to my surprise, he did. That's when I wished he hadn't. Inside, the room looked like some kind of shrine. The walls were covered in black and white photographs, all marked with strange symbols I didn't recognize. In the center was a chair, facing a blank wall, as if someone had spent hours sitting and staring. In one corner, there was a cot with crumpled blankets, and the air smelled stale and unpleasant. Then I noticed the trash, empty chip bags, crumpled water bottles. The realization hit me hard. Someone had been living down there, and not long ago. I thought it couldn't get worse, but then I saw another door. It was small, partially hidden by the dim light. I opened it and found a staircase leading to the cellar door outside. My stomach dropped. I felt like an idiot. I'd never thought to check the cellar door since moving in, assuming it led to the basement. In all that time, I hadn't even opened it. The realization was terrifying. Someone had been living in my house. I replayed the thought over and over, trying to process it. The odd things we'd noticed since moving in suddenly made sense. Items going missing, things being out of place. Until that moment, I'd chalked it up to Taylor's occasional forgetfulness. But this discovery changed everything. I tried calling the previous owners again, demanding answers, maybe even threatening legal action, but they wouldn't pick up. Their number was either disconnected, or they were avoiding us. Taylor was understandably freaked out. That night, I barricaded the cellar door with heavy furniture and chained it shut. No way was I letting anyone sneak back in. The police came, took a full report, and promised to investigate. They also contacted our realtor, who was horrified and vowed to assist. That night, as we were getting ready for bed, we heard it, a loud bang on the front door. Lola went berserk, barking furiously. Taylor and I froze, listening. The banging stopped after a few minutes, but then we heard small rocks tapping against our bedroom window. Taylor clung to Lola, while I grabbed a bat and cautiously looked outside. She begged me not to, but I was livid. I yanked the curtains aside, but the yard was empty. I thought it was over until we heard the sound of glass shattering downstairs. I ran down just in time to see two figures fleeing. The kitchen window was smashed. That's when I finally called the police again. They searched the property but found no one. Their theory was that whoever had been squatting was upset about being locked out and decided to retaliate. It's been 2 days since then. The police are trying to track down the previous owners, but so far, no luck. Whoever was here hasn't come back yet. I'm prepared to defend myself if they do, but I hope it doesn't come to that. This happened several years ago, but it still leaves me with an eerie feeling whenever it crosses my mind. The only reason I'm sharing it now is that enough time has passed, and I don't think there's any risk in putting it online. Back then, my wife and I had just relocated from the city to the suburbs. We'd recently welcomed our third child, and with all the baby supplies, toys, and general chaos, our apartment felt overwhelmingly cramped. We found a nice house in a peaceful, secure neighborhood. The neighbors described it as the kind of place where you wouldn't think twice about leaving your doors unlocked. The house wasn't enormous, but it was a definite upgrade from the small space we'd been living in. One feature that caught my wife's attention was the backyard. It had this beautiful, slightly untamed garden with a few old statues scattered throughout. The statues were weathered and a little unsettling, like something out of a fantasy series. Oddly enough, my wife and I thought they added charm to the yard. Personally, I didn't have strong feelings about them, so I left them as they were, figuring it was less work for me. No complaints there. A few days after we'd settled in, I was looking out the window at the yard when I noticed something unusual. One of the statues, an angel if I'm not mistaken, was facing away from the house. The others were all facing towards it, so it stood out. I was pretty sure they had all originally faced the same direction, but I couldn't say for certain. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I was misremembering. The following morning, I glanced out the window again and noticed something else. Another statue had turned to face away from the house. This time, I was absolutely certain something was off. I asked my wife about it, but she just shrugged and said she hadn't noticed. I thought maybe my son Jimmy, who was quite the little troublemaker back then, was pulling a prank. But when I asked him, he just gave me a puzzled look. I doubted he'd move them anyway. Those statues were no joke to budge. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange was going on, though I had no evidence. I decided not to make a fuss and tried to ignore it. Besides, I had bigger concerns. Money was tight at the time, and I was constantly anxious about the possibility of losing my job. Days went by without incident and I started to relax. Then one evening, as I looked out the window, my heart nearly stopped. All the statues were now lined up in a row at the very edge of the yard, facing the house. The sight was chilling, like something out of a nightmare. I couldn't shake the feeling that their eyes were on me, even though that was impossible. Summoning some courage, I went outside to inspect them. Before stepping out, I scanned the yard nervously to ensure no one was out there. It was daytime, but I couldn't shake my paranoia. Once outside, I tried to move one of the statues and immediately realized how heavy it was, far too heavy for one person to move alone. As I stood there, my wife joined me, and the fear on her face matched mine. She suggested maybe it was a prank by some of the neighbors trying to spook the newcomers, but that explanation didn't hold up. Everyone we'd met seemed normal, and I couldn't imagine anyone doing this to a family with young kids. We called the police, but unsurprisingly, they couldn't do much. They advised us to install security cameras, but we couldn't afford them at the time. I told them we'd consider it, though I wasn't keen on the idea. After they left, I felt slightly better, even though my wife was still deeply unsettled. We decided not to tell the kids about any of it, no need to scare them unnecessarily. For a while, nothing else happened. I convinced myself that whoever was responsible had been scared off by the police's presence. Still, I couldn't shake the unease, as if some unseen presence lingered just beyond my awareness, refusing to let me fully relax. Every time I passed a window, I'd glance outside, half expecting to see something out of place. Living with that constant sense of vulnerability took a heavy emotional toll, leaving me perpetually on edge and unable to fully trust my surroundings, a feeling I wouldn't wish on anyone. Just when we thought things were returning to normal, something else happened. One morning, as the kids played in the yard, I saw it. Large black letters spray-painted on the back wall of our house reading, "Go away." My stomach dropped. Without thinking, I ushered the kids inside and told my wife to stay with them. Then, acting on impulse, I stormed through the garden, yelling threats at whoever might be responsible. In hindsight, it was a reckless move, driven more by frustration and fear than any real plan or sense of control. But no one was there. As I walked back to the house, the adrenaline wore off, replaced by a deep sense of dread. This wasn't just a prank. It felt like a threat. The police came again, but with no leads. They couldn't do much besides take another report. They suggested it might just be teenagers messing around, but I found that hard to believe. They promised to have a patrol car nearby, which offered little comfort. That night, my wife's scream from the living room jolted me. I ran in to see her pointing out the window. Standing in the yard were 5 figures, their faces covered with white masks. They were moving in a bizarre, jerky manner, almost like puppets. We froze, too horrified to react. Finally, I grabbed a kitchen knife, my hands trembling with both fear and determination, and shouted at my wife to call the police, the tension in the room palpable as the reality of our situation set in. Then, foolishly, I ran outside, screaming at the intruders. The sight of the knife must have startled them because they scattered into the garden and disappeared. When the police arrived, they found no trace of anyone. That was the tipping point for me. I didn't care about the cost. I bought security cameras the very next day. My wife was inconsolable for weeks, begging me to move, but I convinced her to give it one more chance. Thankfully, the cameras seemed to do the trick. Whoever it was never returned. We still live in the same house, but to this day we've never gotten any answers about what happened. The memory still haunts me, leaving us to wonder what their true intentions were. If these stories gave you chills, don't forget to hit that like button and share the fear with your friends. Subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales and ring the notification bell so you never miss a hair-raising new upload. Have your own haunted house experience? Drop it in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. Remember, every home holds its secret. Stay safe and sleep with one eye open. See you in the next video.